Thank you very, very much. And welcome to Don't Fail Your Next SharePoint Migration for VisualSP webinars. I am actually very thrilled and always happy to do more webinars. I'm going to have to bug Asif a little bit more often to do more of these webinars. Hopefully, you guys like it, of course. So, welcome. There's no real trick. I'm going to talk about some of the guidance. I'm going to show you what I've learned, some of the epic failures. One of my friends at Heineken has done a migration not too long ago, and there's something interesting happened there as well. When you accidentally bother a couple thousand end users, that's always fun. So we're going to talk about some of the pitfalls. We're going to talk about migrating to on-premises as well as Office 365. Things are definitely changing. Who am I? I'm not going to go over that for too long, but I will say this. If you want to reach out, whether it's on Twitter, if that's what you prefer, go ahead and poke me on Twitter. Otherwise, some people are more comfortable with LinkedIn. Don't feel shy. Just let me know where it's from so that I accept the invitation. But I mean, more than happy to help when there's quick questions, or if you want to just, some people recently just contacted me after a conference and say, look, we have a big migration coming up. It's going to last a couple of months. We want to make sure that the way that we're planning it makes sense for you. Can you just look over it? I'll be more than happy to do so. It's not about consulting or charging things. If I can help, I will help as best as I can. I do have a blog, as mentioned earlier. So by all means, if you're interested in following the content, that's where it is. But essentially, that's that. And I work at Sharegate. So let's get started. I'm going to tell you a little secret. We are going to talk about preparing and assessing your migration before you migrate, because actually that first square, that first tile is actually the hardest part in a migration. People ask me all the time, oh, okay, I'm about to run the migration, what should I be looking out for? Or this is going to be the difficult part. It actually really isn't. Um, Taking the things and moving them to the new location, not so hard. Obviously, I work for a tool, so I want to put that out there first and foremost. I'm not going to talk about my tool at all, but most of the time, especially when going to Office 365, there's a tool involved for the migration. So the actual move part isn't all that difficult. The hardest part in migration is preparing and assessing what's not going to work, what's going to fail, what's going to have an error, what will potentially not work the same way, maybe the re-architecture of the destination, planning it differently. Now you've got groups in Office 365. Or if you come from SharePoint 2007, now there's managed metadata. In 2013, there's a new powerful search engine. So you may not want to do the same things exactly like you used to, because otherwise, why are you even migrating, right? So you got the new side actions on the left and on the right and on the left and on the right. No, you probably want to benefit from a lot of the not just features, what you can bring for your organization, of course. And then at the end, most importantly, how are you going to switch people over to the new destination? Because let's not forget the people involved into this, because by default you start out with them hating you, because nobody likes to change routine. Nobody likes to change. If I used to go to the same file share for the last 20 years, and then you tell me now it's a web page, yeah, I'm gonna be pissed. So there's definitely a lot to take into account. The actual migration piece, I'll tell you what's what. I'll tell you how to move. I'll tell you the different possibilities. I'll tell you what works, what doesn't work. But a lot of it goes into the planning itself. We're gonna look at the post migration and how you can reduce the business impact on your organization for migrate. But first, obviously, why? Why migrate? And I tell this often these days. Um, because it seems like IT, we're kind of stuck in the whole let's just upgrade the version, right? There's a new version, so let's upgrade the version. We go from 2007, 2010 to 2013 to 2016, and then if there's a 2019, you want to switch to the 2019 without really looking at the whole big picture. So you might not need all of this. So it's always important to understand why you're doing a migration in the first place and not just upgrading. So first, you want to retire an older system. It's no longer supported by Microsoft. Fair enough. You're preparing for an expansion. You want to do some cost savings. You're reorganizing, restructuring. Um, Sorry, I muted myself there for a second. Reorganizing and restructuring, solving business problems, actually, I hope the biggest use case for this. If you're migrating to the next version, it's not because the site actions moved places, it's not because it's no longer supported by Microsoft. It's going to be because there's this thing that's really going to solve that problem that you have. The co-authoring works out of the box. There's external sharing. Let's say if you're going to Office 365, or you really have a problem with people having to connect via VPN. Now there's so many devices that you have to support, and the whole VPN story is starting to become difficult for you. And one of those the ways that you want to solve that problem will be via OneDrive for Business, the sync, and the different apps available out there. So those are some of the reasons why you will want to migrate to a different version, whether it's going to be the next version or it's going to be online with Office 365. So first, the inventory. Before you begin anything at all, run an inventory. Absolutely. Know what you have. So usually what I begin is whether information is stored on the file share, SharePoint, another cloud storage if you're on Box or you're on Google Drive, whatever that you're migrating from. You want to run an inventory, and there's a couple of ways to run an inventory. You can use third-party tools. You can use PowerShell. So a lot of the times I've been using PowerShell actually to be able to run and scan, whether it's file share, so system file PowerShell with Windows, whether it's a existing SharePoint using STS ADM command lines back in the days, or it's using the new PowerShell commands if you're on 2013 and up. You want to scan and know what you have. To know the existing metadata, the hierarchy of that repository, how is it structured, where are things located, and also who owns what. I'm going to tell you a kind of the strategy that I use when we do the migrations here locally in the Quebec region in Canada. Yes, I have a little accent. It's French. I apologize. But the idea is really to be able to know what you have and classify it, because you cannot do the migration by yourself. Especially when you start going towards the SharePoint world, you're going to have content owners. You're going to have different people that own all of these different pieces of content, whether it's in marketing, whether it's in sales, and those are the easy business units that we refer to when we do examples. But there's going to be a lot more complexity to this that you're going to have to take into account. Do you have archives? Do you have librarians at the office? And you're going to have to scan all of that you have to identify whether or not you're even bringing it, right? There's always that folder with those documents that haven't been modified since 1998, and no one dares deleting them because it's not theirs. They don't own it, but it's in their structure. It's in their. So you have to put the responsibility on the content owners, and you have to set up some rules. If documents are not that you have inventoried, and I'm talking about documents, but in a context of SharePoint, if you're migrating from an existing SharePoint, you have to know what are the sites that haven't been used, what are the libraries that haven't been used, what are the lists, the content, the items, the documents that haven't been used, because you're not going to spend money, time, and effort to bring them to the destination. There's no point to this unless you need them for retention purposes. They're still in your retention schedule. However, 1998, I think that goes beyond any retention schedules. And I'm saying that because I actually saw that 3 weeks ago. So I'm not just saying, oh, 1998, I saw this. And then when I asked, no one wants to touch it. No, but it hasn't been modified, guys. But that's just the reality. So why just discover your surprises, help understand the projects, and obviously information that you're going to need throughout the project. The way that you can do this, again, manual inventory with PowerShell. There's many other ways to do a manual inventory. That's completely up to you, but there's a bunch of free tools from Microsoft. Then you can do your own report, whether it's going to be with Excel, whether it's going to be on a Word document. There's tons of ways for you to do this, or of course you can run a third-party tool. A number of tools are available out there, and most of the time the inventory piece, they will offer it for free as part of the trial of the software, or as part of a free part of the software, because it helps you get started for the migration. So as part of the inventory, there's no reason for you to not have a complete inventory of what you have. And that's especially important because it's going to help us get to the next step, which is going to be the assessment. Once you know what you have, it makes it easier for us that are planning the migration to know whether or not you need to, you know, um, make a plan for it. How hard is it going to migrate this file share? Is it going to take 2 weeks? Is it going to take a month? Is it going to take 3 months? Well, that's going to depend on your inventory. How many files do you have that have invalid characters? How many files do you have that have invalid file names and invalid file paths that are not going to go in something like SharePoint? And how many files are access files that are not really well supported within your SharePoint environment for the whole database to run properly with your links? If you have a lot of Excel files that have a lot of formulas that depend on other Excel file, have you prepared universal data connection files? So there's a lot to consider that comes from the inventory in the first place before you can even start doing the architecture of the destination or even think of your migration. The other thing that I'm definitely going to encourage you to know, Microsoft has I obviously have not put the link in this slide, and I should have, but there's a nice, if you Google or Bing, whatever you prefer, the keyword SharePoint software boundaries and limits. So that's SharePoint software boundaries and limits. You can find that article, and it really gives you all of there are actual limits in SharePoint, whether it's in team sites, whether it's in OneDrive for Business, whether they're view limits, whether they're view threshold limits. You know, a document library can have up to 30 million documents. However, if you have more than 5,000 items in that document library, or documents in this case, you're going to have a view threshold because of the SQL Server database that is behind the scenes that have a lock on the database if it starts growing beyond that number. So how can you work around that? How can you plan accordingly? Put documents into folders, maybe add the automatic management of indices that's available in SharePoint 2016 on premises. Or if you're in Office 365, you may want to look at doing manual indexes on your document libraries or your list before you start adding content and customize your views on that content. There are site collection limits, there are file size limits, right? So I'll give you a very quick example that people seem to, kind of go over it. Yes, Microsoft has a file size limit of 10 gigabyte. That means you can upload files that are up to 10 gigabyte into your document libraries on, I'm talking Office 365 in this case. If you're on-prem, you can put whatever you want. You control the server. But online, it's a 10 gig file size limit. However, the migration API, so Microsoft has a migration API that allows you to migrate yourself, and we'll talk about that in just a few moments. But the migration API doesn't support past 2 gigabyte yet. It's still stuck under 2 gigabyte. So you have to take that into consideration. So know the limits. Go to that article that Microsoft keeps updating for both 2016, or if you're going to 2013, or online with Office 365, software boundaries and limits to figure that out. It is super crucial. So now that you have your inventory, and one last thing before I do this, that first item on the list, team sites versus OneDrive for Business. It is very, very important to understand something. Um, OneDrive for Business is not a place for you to start migrating to unless you're talking about home folders or My Documents from your end users. OneDrive for Business is more of a personal space that each individual in your organization gets. OneDrive for Business is not where you migrate the marketing documents to. It is not where you migrate the R&D or the sales documents to, right? OneDrive for Business is what Jonathan gets. It's what Stephanie gets. It's what Benjamin gets. It's what Asif gets. It's a personal library in a personal site collection. Of course, it does more. It allows me to explore. There's a sync feature, but it's from my perspective of files, is from the individual. Whereas a team site is a central location, it's centralized place that is owned by the marketing department, by the sales department, by the R&D for you to store the files into. and have available regardless of whether the individual leaves the company or comes. Whereas if I have a OneDrive for Business, when I leave the company, the OneDrive for Business goes away and all files in it. So it's very important to really understand the difference between a team site collection, hold on, a little cough coming, there we go, and OneDrive for Business. Sorry about that. I couldn't get to the mute in time this time. That's what happens when when winter starts arriving here in Canada. We start getting our cold and we fight it. We don't want to put our scarves yet because we think it's still summer, but it really isn't. So definitely make sure you understand the difference between those two before you move forward. All right. So the assessment. Now, the assessment piece is the next step after the inventory and is just as important. Now that we know what we have to know whether what we have is ready to migrate. And this is a number of things that will no longer work at the destination. This is the most common list that I get. The URLs, the file path, and the file names, they're either too long, they basically have characters that are not supported that you have to take into consideration. Even if you're coming from an existing on-premises to another or on-premises to Office 365, you have to realize that the URLs might no longer work depending on your tenant, depending on the URL change that you might put into place. Some deep paths may just no longer work. The file size, the character limitations, custom solutions. Do you have sandbox solutions? Because a couple of weeks ago, months ago, Microsoft just kind of disabled any sandbox solution that had code in it from working in Office 365. That means you can expect something similar on premises as well. So if you have a number of custom solutions, how are you going to convert them into the next thing, whether it's a SharePoint framework or some kind of add-in or another type of way to provision your custom solutions into the destination environment? There is a solution out there from third parties as well that help you do that you can look for. Otherwise, you may have to rewrite the code yourself. So is that worth it? And that's where the inventory and the assessment comes in. You need to have an inventory of all your custom solutions. And then you need the assessment part to tell you what's in that custom solution. Does it just create content types, site columns, list libraries in your site? If that's the case, then you're fine. Or does it have actual code that runs within it that will not work at the destination that you have to think on how to create in a new method? Branding, folks, you could just forget about. There's no way to keep your branding whenever you change version. If you're going from 2013 to 2013 or 2016 to 2016, you're fine. Most likely you can obviously keep your branding, but there's no way, regardless of using tools or anything of the sort, there's no way to maintain the branding that you've developed on your SharePoint team sites, on your intranet, on whatever, to another version of SharePoint. All right, the HTML structure of the master pages, the controls for the site actions, the ribbon, all of that is completely different from version to version. In fact, there's even no longer any ribbon in SharePoint Online, and there's no longer going to be a ribbon in SharePoint 2016 in the future through feature packs as well once it catches up to SharePoint Online. So just think about that for a second. All of the branding, all of the CSS that you may have applied, that will no longer work. Workflows, that's a big question. Your workflow state, so is it in current running? What's the history of your workflows? That cannot, I repeat, cannot be kept unless you basically void your warranty with Microsoft. Because the only way to keep the workflow state in the history as you migrate to another version is to go and manipulate the SQL Server database, which makes you no longer supported by Microsoft. So basically, you can say goodbye to your workflow state in history. You can bring in your workflows, basically bringing your workflow configuration so the workflow still exists at the destination, but anything else is just not going to be kept. InfoPath, as long as you understand that what's the future of InfoPath, that it will no longer be supported in 2026, but that you can still use it both on Office 365 or on 2013, 2016, then you're fine. Go ahead and use InfoPath. You know, I'm more than happy to migrate that over for you. But the next, basically, though there's no migration path, Microsoft is looking to something called Power Apps to replace the same requirement that we used InfoPath for before, which is forms for SharePoint, but now it's also for other things than just SharePoint. Power Apps works both on premises with a gateway and with SharePoint Online as well. So you'll have to look at, okay, through the inventory that I have, how many InfoPath forms do we have, and what is the complexity and the requirements for these forms? Are they supposed to work on every browser? Are they supposed to work on mobile devices? Yes, then maybe that's going to go into a Power App instead, because InfoPath is pretty much horrible for mobile device and the complexity of it. But if you have a standardized environment, everybody using Internet Explorer version X, then you're fine. Go ahead and migrate your InfoPath form. You know, keep an eye for your permissions. If you look at, for example, SharePoint 2010 has the owners group, the members group, and the visitors group, right? And in SharePoint 2013, 2016, or SharePoint Online, you have the same groups: owners, members, visitors. What you may have not have realized, however, is that the members group by default, as of 2013 and up, has much more power in terms of permissions, right? In 2010, all it could do is contribute, add or remove content. As of 2013 and up, they can also edit your site. That means create lists and libraries and delete them. So when you're doing your migration, you have to take into consideration that the permissions that you had granted for all of your sites, all of your lists and libraries to the members group, by migrating, you may be granting a whole lot more power that you may have not wanted initially. So that's to take into consideration. And again, that's what the inventory plus the assessment comes into play. Right? The inventory is to know what you have. The assessment is to add all of these rules next to the inventory. And don't worry, I'll give you a way to automate all of this. But that's the way to be able to know this is going to be a problem, this is going to work, this is not going to work, right? Unsupported site templates. There's no more blank site template. If you're going to Office 365, the team site template has changed now. It's connected to Office 365 groups. Also, if you're going to migrate to Office 365, what about Office 365 group? Do you want your existing SharePoint site collections to migrate as independent site collections? Or do you want your SharePoint site collections to migrate as group connected site collections? So you have to take that into consideration as well. The community site template, the product catalog template. What are you going to do with all of your existing site templates, basically? What if you have the Fabulous 40, wow. All of these things. Orphaned users. Orphaned users is not the end of the world. Basically, it's users that had been granted access, or in a metadata people or group column in your SharePoint list were added, and then these people have been disabled from your Active Directory. So they're still in your SharePoint site, they're still referenced, but they're kind of orphaned users. So you want to clean them up before you bring that to the destination. Oh boy, checked out files, my number one enemy. I don't know about you, if you're preparing a migration, definitely one of the first reports you want to run is give me a list of all the checked out files that I have in my environment. Because people forget to check them back in most of the time, right? Or they're checked out file from years ago, from months ago. You cannot migrate checked out files unless you're doing a database attach, and I'll talk to you about that in a few seconds. But you cannot migrate checked out files because they're checked out to the user. So you don't have access to any of the modifications made to that document since it's been checked out. So you want to contact the owners and ask them to check back in by this date and hour, for example, which would be your milestone of your migration. Same thing for your list templates and libraries template file extensions. Now let me talk to you about alerts. Um, a very good friend, Rami in Heineken, and he gave me permission to talk about that story because at this point it's just better that you guys learn from that as well. So basically, they were doing a migration, and you have this thing on in SharePoint that's existed for quite some time now, and they're called user alerts. User alerts, if you're not familiar with it, is the ability for people to set alerts so that if something happens on a document or list, they get an email alert to tell them that, hey, somebody modified the document based on these conditions that you've set. I've sent you an alert. If you're going to do a migration and there are alerts, and you're not ready to tell your end users that their documents have been migrated because you're doing a multiple iteration, incremental migration, for example. This is especially typical for large scale migrations that take weeks or months usually. What happened there is that they migrated their SharePoint and they were going to tell everyone later on, but the user alerts got migrated and so they triggered, and all of a sudden, thousands of end users at Heineken started getting emails about their documents in another location that they were not aware of being modified and created. So obviously, panic ensued because people were wondering, hey, what are you doing with my documents? Where are my documents going? There was no communication, and the alerts started triggering everywhere. So you definitely want to be very careful to disable alerts at the destination. Do your migration and re-enable alerts once you are finished and done for. This could be a timer job that you want to disable. This may be just the concept of alerts. And of course, depending on the tool that you use, you could choose to whether or not you want to migrate the alerts or not. But be aware that the alerts are going to do their job. It could be a really bad idea. So what about assessment? Is there a way for you to run a assessment? And what that means is you have a free tool from Microsoft. It's called the SMAT tool, the SharePoint Migration and Assessment tool. And it works specifically with 2013. It also works with 2013. And essentially what it does is it scans everything that you have. It's going to look for alerts, apps, browser file handling, checked out files, customized pages, master pages, email enabled lists, file versions that are too large, sites that are locked, large list views. I mean, it's going to go through the list of all the usual problems. And then it's going to generate a CSV and reports to tell you where you're going to have an issue. This is 100% free. Again, this is for the Microsoft version. Once again, you can look at third-party tools. Most of them have a free inventory and assessment tool as well that will give you a different layout and different visual. But the checks are usually the same. I do believe I have that I saved on my computer. I apologize. I definitely should have prepared that beforehand. But let me go and check. I have it handy. Pre-migration analysis. I believe that is it. There we go. So I'm going to open up the Excel file. I'm going to open up and bring it to this screen as soon as it opens. Bear with me here. There we go. So this is essentially the type of things that you will get. It's going to scan, then you will have tabs. It'll tell you all the features that you have and where they are. It's going to give you web parts of what you have and where they are and things like this. Master pages, content, and it's going to give you kind of the condition, the errors that the potential problems that you can get by migrating to Office 365 or to the destination. Of course, you have third-party tools and you can leverage experts as well, but be careful with that, and I'll tell you why. This is the plan that I recommend. I hope you guys are having a good time. Don't forget that there's a question box, and at the end of this webinar, I will try and go into the questions in the last 15 minutes and answer them live or just through the chat as possible. Now, when you're making a plan, I usually try to tell you to specify or identify, remove, migrate, or rebuild. Now, here's what I do. I use the free tools or the third-party tools, and and I run the inventory. I run the inventory to know what I have, but with that inventory, I run the assessment. The assessment is going to, generally speaking, identify the effort required to migrate. But I always will add a certain level of human check onto it. So I have usually that Excel file that I was talking to you about. I'll see the list of my site collections, my sites, my lists, my libraries. But typically speaking, I stay at the site collection level. And then I'm going to have a sort of a grading system for the effort it takes me to migrate based on the assessment, based on the list, the master pages, the custom solutions that are in that site collection, the number of items in lists and libraries, and all of the things that we talked about in the assessment. And that's going to give me that inventory file. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to create a new column, and I'm going to choose whether I'm going to remove this. That means I'm not going to migrate it at all. I'm going to migrate this and I'm going to keep it basically as it is, or we're going to rebuild this. So if you look at my Excel files with my inventory and my assessment, I basically go through everything. And based on the effort level, I'm going to say whether it's a remove, it's a migrate, or it's a rebuild. And of course, I always have another column which identifies the content owner, who owns that site collection. Not necessarily the site collection admin, because sometimes that can be IT based on the organization, but who owns this content? Because I'm going to go through a certain amount and I'm going to say, hey, are we keeping this? Are we migrating this? Or are we rebuilding it because we want to leverage it differently in the destination? Maybe it's going to be a group. So we're going to let go of the SharePoint calendar that's horrible, and we're going to use the Outlook calendar part of the SharePoint site collection. Maybe we'll use Power BI instead of the KPI list. Maybe we'll use Yammer instead of the newsfeed. Things like this that we might have to rebuild. And then what we do is it's very important when you do your migration to set milestones, right? And when I mean milestones, it means things that you're actually going to deliver on time. It is super crucial. But how can you plan these milestones? And that's using the inventory and the point system that I'm talking about essentially, right? As the assessment tool allowed you to tell you whether this is going to be a complex level 9 or a complex level 2, easy, hard, you're going to be able to say, look, typically with the team of 5 people that we have, we can generally speaking fit 17 points or 20 points into a 2-week span. And that allows you to go into your uh, not the decision makers, that group of people that usually, what do you call that again? Oh my God. Sometimes you come back from the Bahamas and you get those blanks. Basically, you have that committee that involves people from different business units that are involved in this migration. And you're going to tell them, look, we're 5 people. We can do 17 points per 2 weeks. Here's the list of all the site collection and the points that we attributed to them. Let us know what we're going to remove, what we're going to migrate, what we're going to be able to rebuild. And then together, we're going to prioritize using this set of milestones every 2 weeks, what will be done based on how many points we can fit in those 2 weeks. If you're part of a development cycle in your company, if you're part of the developers, you're familiar with this. This is Scrum. This is Agile, basically, right? It's very, very similar where we do a Scrum for 2 weeks and we say how much effort we can put in delivering those 2 weeks. Well, we apply the same thing in that migration effort. Now, sometimes, is it really worth it to migrate, or is it just better to connect? And what I mean by connect is hybrid, right? If you're going to Office 365, do you really need to migrate what you have in 2013 or if you have 2016? Or can you just connect in a hybrid and leverage some of what you have in Office 365? Whoops, I accidentally pressed escape. Um, it's important to note, I'm going to be very honest with you. Hybrid with Office 365 and SharePoint on premises, it's not really hybrid. It's more like connected. That's why I like to use that word instead. The only thing that's hybrid between SharePoint on-prem and SharePoint Online is the search engine. So every search-driven feature, Delve, the Search Center, and anything else that I can't think of right now that's driven by search, by the graph, and by Delve, then you can have a true hybrid experience. But otherwise, there is nothing else other than hyperlinks that changes. You can say that when people click on OneDrive, it goes to their OneDrive online instead of their OneDrive on premises. You can say that when they click on Newsfeed or Yammer, rather, it goes to Yammer that's in the cloud, obviously, instead of using the Newsfeed feature that comes on prem. But there's no hybrid feature that really exists. But it's more of a question of what is the experience you want to provide to your end users. If you're going to ask me, I prefer that you have SharePoint 2016 on premises if you're doing hybrid. The reasoning for this is that through the feature packs that are coming out, the feature packs are matching SharePoint 2016 to the experience of interface that is available with SharePoint Online. The problem, if you stay on 2013 to do the hybrid, which is not a problem per se, is that your end users will see a confusion. How come their team sites look so different? How come there's a ribbon sometimes and there's no ribbon some other times? So that's definitely weird. But regardless of whether you're SharePoint 2013 or SharePoint 2016 on-prem connected to hybrid, Microsoft has released a PowerShell command that you have to go and download. It's some sort of a tool basically that allows you to connect an app launcher of online with the app launcher of on premises. So question number one, yes, on SharePoint 2013, you can have an app launcher, a suite bar. This is part of the service pack that came, I think it was service pack 1, and now cumulative updates to have that extra command line. And 2016 obviously already has an app launcher. But the new feature pack and for 2016 and a command line for 2013 allows you to sync the app launcher that is available online for your end users with the app launcher that you have on-prem for your end users. So when you customize for the end users one, it reflects it on both environments. And I think for hybrid, the hardest challenge that you will have is the user experience and communication. Don't forget that hybrid is extremely costly as well because you have to maintain two environments. You have to learn two environments. There's patching on two environments. It's not less expensive to not do a migration and have a hybrid environment. All right. The migration itself. The migration methods, there are four. Well, there's actually five. I'm going to go over them and then we're going to talk about the pros and cons for each and every one of them. I'm not going to go over this entire track. Is Microsoft has something called Fast Track. And Fast Track offers a number of things. It offers free documents that you can send out to help with communication. So they have email templates that you can go download. They have presentations that you can download to share internally about what they're going to benefit from going to, say, Office 365. But they have some stuff for SharePoint 2016 as well. They have the assessment tool that you can download. But Fast Track also delivers free migrations. And what I mean by that is if you have 150 seats in Office 365 or more, if you're in any part of the enterprise SKUs, whether G and A SKUs and K SKUs, nonprofit SKUs, you're going to be able to benefit from a free migration. Now, the free migration, you have to be aware that it does involve quite a bit of work and it does involve working with Microsoft because they don't know what you have, what you want to migrate. You have to deliver everything to them. So you have to do the work yourself with, they'll have helper files and Excel files to help you get started. They'll help you go from single Google Apps for work environment or Google Drive, from file shares, from Box, from file shares in SharePoint 2013 as well, to SharePoint Online or OneDrive for Business. And they'll do the migration for you, but there are a lot of, work involved, and what if this, what if that, and you have to be willing to wait for them to get to you as well in the waiting list. But that is available. Basically include, if you're smaller than 150, they'll still give you the migration guidances, they'll give you the documents, they'll give you the assessments, that they won't do the migration for you themselves. But essentially, regardless, you can go to Fast Track and you can download a bunch of documents and templates. A lot of the time people ask me, do you have a templates I can send to my content owners, to my different business unit? All of that is available and constantly updated by Microsoft on the Fast Track website. Um, what about PowerShell? There is a free option. It's really called the Migration API or the Migration Pipeline. Microsoft has made available a way for you to migrate to Office 365. I'll talk about migrating to SharePoint on-premises in a few seconds. Actually, it's probably the next slide, or soon to be the next slide. But Microsoft has made a PowerShell that allows you to migrate for free into Office 365. I have worked with it, so I do want to be very clear that it is really, when we say it's for small projects, we mean for small project. Um, I'm going to tell you why. The way that it works is very similar to, if you're familiar with the old import with SharePoint Designer and export with SharePoint Designer. It's essentially very, very similar. What it does is you create a bunch of small packages with a manifest file, an XML file that says what is inside the package. Oh, little cough coming. Sorry about that. I'd rather not cough in your face. So basically, you create these small packages, you put your files in the package, you have an XML file that tells you where are the files or what are the files inside the packages and where do they go at the destination. However, you have to split the packages into your own small 2 GB packages maximum. You have to create the XML file that says where are things going to go, and the destination has to have the structure already prepared. That means the site has been created, the lists and libraries have to be created, the columns have to be created. So for an existing SharePoint migration, though it's possible, I definitely would not recommend using the migration pipeline for that. For file share or simple file share migration, of course you can definitely use the migration API for that. The way that it works, let me click and go to the next one, is essentially this way. You create a new command line for the new SharePoint migration package. You convert it into a SharePoint Online targeted migration package. That means it includes your destination tenant, and then you upload it to Azure. Basically, if you look at the circles at the destination, the way that it really works is you create a little small package that says where it goes, and instead of migrating, how can I explain this? The biggest challenge for migrating to Office 365 is SharePoint, because it's throttled. If you try to migrate through the SharePoint server, Microsoft, to protect themselves from hacks, from DDoS attacks, they throttle the request that anybody can make. So that slows down the migration speeds if you're using the regular client-side object model, the web services, and so on. So what Microsoft decided to do is to allow you to upload very quickly just the files into a storage container. It's as if you would transfer your files into a file share that is hosted in Azure next to your Office 365 tenant. And that's what we're talking about when we're talking about SPO migration package Azure source. You're basically uploading your package into a storage container in Azure, and then there's a migration job. Microsoft comes and picks up, reads the package, and goes and put it in your tenant with the right settings. When you look at migration tools, most of the time they will automatically do these packages for you, and that's how they do the faster migration. If you look at any of the migration tools out there, you'll see they have some kind of a migration API support. They do everything behind the scenes for you so that you just drag and drop your migration. If you're doing it yourself, you have to create the package, you have to create the storage container, and you have to submit the migration job yourself. So that's the differences between the two essentially. If you're migrating to on-premises, the do-it-yourself version is using the database attach. When you're working in SharePoint, everything you do, as soon as you are within site collections, everything you do in SharePoint is stored in what we call a content database. And you can take that content database and you can migrate it to the next version of SharePoint, but only the next version of SharePoint. What I mean by that is if you're on 2010, you can migrate to 2013 and 2013 only. If you're in 2013, you can migrate to 2016 and 2016 only. There is no database attached migration to Office 365, and there is no hopping of a version for on-premises. You can only go to the next version of SharePoint. So this is extremely not valuable for multiple reasons. The biggest pros for this is the speed because you can detach, attach it to the next version. Everything is going to be kept as is from the source. Upgrade. You may want to be careful with your workflows that we're running. My biggest recommendation, if you're going to do a database attach, stop any running workflows before you detach the database and upgrade it at the destination by attaching it. That's the number one issue that I have seen. Of course, you lose all of your branding. If you're migrating from 2010 to 2013, SharePoint 2013 installs SharePoint 2010. So you can actually leave everything running in 2010 mode and then site collection by site collection do what we call the deferred site collection upgrade. So that means you keep everything in 2010 running with the code that is in 2010, but on your 2013 server, and then site collection by site collection, choose to upgrade it or not upgrade it. There's even a simulation that actually upgrades your 2010 site collection to 2013 somewhere else that will automatically get deleted so you can see whether or not it's going to work and then actually do it. This, however, does not exist in 2016. SharePoint 2016 does not install 2013 and does not have the deferred site collection upgrade. That means if you're doing a database attached from 2013 to 2016, you better hope it works. And of course, you bring everything as it was before. So that's not the migration time is the ideal time to run that inventory, see what's not been used, do some cleanup, and at the very least, change the architecture of things. Maybe merge sites together, maybe leverage the search engine a little bit more for your sites instead of doing those static intranet sites, for example. So third-party tools, obviously pros, migrate more than content. You can migrate your lists, your libraries, you can change them up, you can restructure, which is the next point. You can leverage the migration API as well. But if you use the free migration API, it doesn't migrate the structure, it just migrates the content. That's for Office 365. If you're doing the database attach, you don't get to have that granularity that you get with third-party tools that allows you to reorganize and restructure. But that could be a good thing. If you're happy with your environment and you just want to bring it to the next version, by all means, I'm not trying to shove down a third-party tool down your throat. I'm just giving you all of the facts. There are the ability to script and schedule. Now, if you're using PowerShell, you can schedule and script that as well. So that is a pro for the PowerShell script as well. And generally speaking, when you're looking at the price of migration tools versus how much it would take the time for you to do it yourself, generally speaking, it'll be more affordable. But yes, it is an additional cost that you can see if you're not taking into account the cost of the time spent from your team on the migration effort. If you're going to use experts, which is always a good idea if they're actual expert, look at my con of here. In many cases, you deal with consultants that come from Exchange that do not come from the SharePoint world. They figured out that they can make a little bit extra money by doing also SharePoint migrations, but they can't. Their SharePoint requires an expertise. So make sure that when you get experts for your migration, make sure that they're actual experts. The pros, the pro, of course, they know SharePoint Online and OneDrive for Business. They already know the limitations. They know the impacts of the file share migration or your existing on-premises migration. So that's generally speaking going to be better. However, the biggest con is obviously the cost, because now not only are you paying for their services, but generally speaking, they're also going to purchase a third-party tool for the migration to work. So this goes without saying, always test the migration before you actually start doing the actual migration. I'll give you an example. We have a very large customer that's in the midst of doing their migration right now to Office 365. So obviously, them in this case, they're using Sharegate, but it could be any other scenario or other third-party tools. Now, what they have is they have terabytes of content, and they know it's going to take a couple of months to migrate everything. So what they're doing to migrate their on-premises environment is that they're setting up a staging environment for migration. What they're going to do is they're setting up an entire new infrastructure for SharePoint, new web front ends, new SharePoint servers, a different SQL server, and they're doing a database attach, but within basically a backup and restore into this other environment. And then what they're doing is that they're heavily bombarding these servers as much as they can to migrate to Office 365. And then they're going to do an incremental migration by taking the backups regularly and upgrading their destination staging environment. And with the tool, scripting that migration to the destination so that it does that incremental migration. That's one way to do it. However, they need to plan and pilot this to make sure that it works, to make sure that it's going to be something that actually saves them time. Otherwise, they could just add an extra web front-end server on their existing farm and specify their migration tool to only use that web front-end server for performance reasons. Now, what about the large-scale migrations in general? They have two options. They can use Azure Express Route. That's going to create a sort of a VPN or a secure tunnel between Office 365 and on-premises. So that is ideal when you don't want to kind of have the impact of the internet and everything else that goes along that. Though everything is always secured when you migrate, this actually really creates that express route between the tenant and your on-premises. You can also ship your disks, but it comes with a lot of work in terms of packaging your disk at the source. You still have to create the packages that I was talking about, the migration packages, and then shipping your disk. So it's not as simple as creating a backup of your database, putting in a disk, and sending it to Microsoft. You also have to take into consideration the time in between sending the disk, mounting it, and running, and what about what's been happening on premises? How are you going to do that incremental migration? But this shipping is also a possibility. One thing that people always ask me is the speed of migration, and unfortunately, there's no real way to calculate this. If you're doing an on-premises migration, of course, database attach is going to take quite a few. Sorry, it's going to be quite quick. However, there are going to be impacts even with the database attached. So you have to be careful when you're patching your servers at the destination, because once you mount that database, it's going to apply all of the patches on all your content database. So there are tips and tricks so that it is already patched before you can bring your database over to the destination. Because sometimes the database attached even can take hours, sometimes a day, to be able to upgrade itself to the destination. So take that into consideration, and take into consideration that people are still working at the source during that time. Find your bottlenecks. Most people don't realize that their bandwidth is a huge problem, right? If you're migrating to another server or you're migrating online, especially online, if your upload, megabit speed is not up to par, and I see this too frequently, unfortunately. People migrating to Office 365 and don't realize that their bandwidth, their internet speed, is going to have a direct impact on how they work, both download speed and upload speed. So identified your bottleneck. Look, there's a way to analyze your bandwidth internally in your network. Do you have network people that can see the availability of your bandwidth on a given day so that you can see whether or not there's enough bandwidth to start migrating gigs and terabytes of data through that network? Are you going to impact your end users for the rest of their work? Or should you plan it during the weekend where you have more available bandwidth or evenings, right? Or just improve the overall network internally. You want to automate, you want to script scheduling, set the expectations, type of data, number of metadata, right? The speed of the migration is going to be directly be impacted by the number of metadata that you have and the number of versions that you have. I cannot tell you how fast your list is going to migrate or your library is going to migrate unless you tell me how much versioning there is on each document and how many columns there is, because that instantly and exponentially grows the migration speed. The best for you to do is set a benchmark test, right? Create yourself a fake Microsoft Office 5 tenant. If you're a Microsoft partner, there's demos. I think it's microsoftoffice.com, where you can create or generate a fake environment for Office 365 and test your migration speed with the data that you have currently, the number of columns, the versioning, so you can set speed expectations for the overall migration, because you'll always want to set milestones for all of this. Make sure you identify your migration waves and the schedules, what I was just talking about, to minimize the read-only time. Usually what I do is, after I started migrating the site collection from on-prem to online or on-prem to the other SharePoint Server 2016, then Microsoft has a way, SharePoint has a way to set your site collections as read-only. So people can still access the data, but cannot save anything new. They'll have to go to the new location to save. Right? Use the holidays to your advantage if you actually want to spend your holidays then. Post migration, run post migration reports. Usually, what I do is I create a post migration report for each of the content owners. Right? Remember the inventory that we created earlier with the assessment? You have a column that is who is the content owner for that. And then I'm going to send them a migration report for each piece that I migrated. Here's what it is now. Here's the permissions that are assigned now to make sure that they can validate that as well. It's not just about the content migrated. And make sure that there's the exact same amount of documents so they can see the number of documents and items before, the number of documents and items after as well. Redirect your users. Whether you're doing link redirects with IIS, whether you're doing warning banners, that means you change the master page in SharePoint that gives a big banner at the top so that everyone knows that they're in an environment that's no longer good, that's no longer going to be updated, with a hyperlink to the new destination. Change your file shares to read-only if you're doing a file share migration. Source read-only with a link or visual to the new location. Communication. Make sure that there's a hard stop deadline. If you said that you're going to be done by this date, you're done by this date. If you start doing, oh, okay, I'll add it a little bit, you'll never do your migration successfully. Obviously, there's tons of communication that you have to do. Here's my tip. Pretend that you're in a mall and you're the owner of this coffee shop, or you have your own little store in the mall. This is your existing SharePoint server, and you want to migrate to the destination. You want to go to another store. You're moving in the mall. You're going to another location because it's bigger, because it's better located, because of X amount of things. This is why you're going to the next version of SharePoint. Think of everything that you would do for your store in the mall. Would you overnight close down your shop and open up somewhere else and hopefully the customers would know where it is? No, you've seen this many times. There's tons of announcements before. We're going to move soon. When you're building at the new location, you put a sign up, coming soon, and it's going to be better because of this, because of that, because of this, right? You're going to have influencers, right? The person at the cashier that's going to tell you, hey, here's a coupon. When we go to the new destination, you'll get 25% off. Things like this to spread the message, to communicate. So pretend that you're a store in a mall that's going to a new location in the mall. Everything that you would do to announce the destination, whether it's at the new destination, whether it's within the old store, what would you do? Would you put banners up? Would you put things on the wall? Then why are there not banners on your team site? Why not add a new item in the quick launch of every single site collection that shows a link to the new destination? That when you get to the destination, it's a wonderful page that explains what's happening. What are they going to be? What are the benefits from this change? What are the end users going to gain from going to the destination? Right? So basically, communication constantly throughout the whole migration project, whether it's during the RMR process, the remove, migrate, or rebuild, the inventory and assessment, the planning of it, the post migration. Look, I know there's a lot. So what I've done for you is I've done a migration checklist. You can download it at bit.do/migrate checklist. The slides are going to be available after this, but this is what the checklist looks like. You download it and you can print it and you can see whether you've done an inventory, and these are all the things that I'm recommending you do an inventory of, because I may have not listed all of them while I'm doing this speech. You can take some notes on the sides as well. But even if you're using it as a PDF, you can just type it in yourself right here. So you don't have to actually print it. You can use the checkboxes as well right here. So this is a pretty cool checklist if you ask me. Then you have it for cleaning the old environment. Have you removed any empty SharePoint groups? Have you deleted any unused content types and workflows? Have you found any large site collections? Should you break them up into multiple site collections? Clean up items containing too many custom permissions. Rethink and reorganize very large lists. So the checklist really goes through everything from the source, the planning, the inventory, the migration itself, the post-migration. And I even asked my friend, look at all this, for workflows as well. You get all of this as part of this webinar with VisualSP today. The post-migration stuff that you should run. And of course, I asked a friend that is a developer, what are the consideration for custom solutions? If you have code, what can you do? Do you have sandbox solution? Will it still work in 2016? And some of the pain points that you can find in Office 365 as well. So definitely go and check out this migration checklist if you're interested. Hopefully it's going to give you something to go out with at the end of this webinar, along with the guidelines. Of course, you don't have to listen to me. Right? You can say, nah, this presentation was horrible. I don't need your help. I'll do it my own way. And basically what I will is drag and drop using the files with the Explorer view. Why is that horrible? Because you will lose all modified date, created date, modified by, created by, version history, metadata. You lose everything. This is the same story if you're going to use the OneDrive for Business sync. Some people tell me they're going to use the sync feature to migrate. This is not a good idea. Yes, it's good for OneDrive for Business. It's not good for your team side document libraries because, of course, it's not going to keep any of your metadata at all. And of course, it doesn't guarantee the sync. Even though you're using the new sync, it's going to be able to maintain that level of performance. Yeah, I'm going to do an overnight migration. I'm not going to tell anyone. Or forget some of the content because I have no inventory. I have no idea what I have. That's something that I see very, very often. People just think they know what they got in their site collections or in their file shares. Some people decide to migrate everything under OneDrive for Business instead of team sites because they think they've got more free space, even though OneDrive for Business has no content approval, has no metadata, has no subsites. You cannot create lists or libraries. So definitely do not do this. Migrate to your team site unless you're telling me you're migrating your home folders and my documents. Migrate from home so that you're using the internet that you have at home, which is horrible. Or build a migration tool myself. I've heard this many, many times. You have to. There are many consideration and pitfalls with migration. You cannot just take a library and migrate it. There are things that no longer works, metadata that no longer works. How are you going to deal with the term store? You can try to do this. I take into consideration that many migration tool have been building them for 5+ years, 10 years, and they're still trying to support every scenario. So I'm sure you have amazing people. I doubt you'll be able to build your own migration tool. In short, don't consider your bandwidth. That'll be a fail. Sent only to OneDrive for Business instead of SharePoint Team Site. That'll be a fail. Use the Explorer view only, not identifying what won't work, using an assessment and inventory, or thinking that it's going to be a one-to-one, even though so many things have changed with SharePoint 2016 and Office 365 with groups and the new SharePoint site collections, the modernized sites with the new pages. There's so many things to take into consideration that a one-to-one cannot guarantee success. Folks, thank you so much. I'll stick around for questions. I hope you've enjoyed this webinar, and thank you, VisualSP, again for hosting these amazing webinars. We'll see you at the next one. Yeah, absolutely. Sorry, I was muted. I didn't want to bother. So if I go through the questions very quickly, I see that a couple of people asked about the recording, the slides. Everything will be made available after the webinar by ASIF and Visual SP team. I have also recorded a video. So for those of you that may have had some sound issues, that's going to be clear cut from my end. So there's no internet involved in there. If we're talking about Fast Track able to migrate from SharePoint 2016 on premises to Office 365, or is it just for 2013? At the moment, it really is just for 2013. But I'm sure if you call and you say you want to go to from 2016, they'll likely help you as well. It is currently a limited time offer, so definitely contact them sooner than later. Is there a free migration assessment tool for SharePoint 2010? There is no free migration assessment tool for 2010 from Microsoft, but if you go look at third-party tools, obviously there's many third-party tools. I work for Sharegate. I can tell you that Sharegate has a free inventory and assessment tool. You just download the trial and you can definitely look at that. But if you don't want to look, there are definitely other tools that have that as well. I assume ship this is part of Fast Track migration option. It is, but usually Fast Track, when they're going to do the migration for you, a lot of the times they're going to use their own tools, or they're going to leverage some other tools as well. But yes, if depending on the size of things you want to migrate, they're going to do ship disk as well. How do we get the migration checklist? Very good question. I'm going to go back to that slide. It's a URL that you can download. There it is on the screen at the bottom left. Otherwise, again, the slides will be made available and you'll be able to download that migration checklist. Let me see. Other question. Migrate all lists from SharePoint 2013 to other SharePoint 2013 using Sharegate. All are fine. But lookup columns are lost. That was definitely a mistake. Either contact us at Sharegate. We support fully lookup columns, even lookup columns within the same SharePoint list, so you should be fine. How do we get the migration checklist? Already answered that. Is there an inventory tool part of Sharegate? Absolutely. You can download Sharegate for free as part of the trial. There's an inventory tool there. What a brilliant session. Why, thank you. Appreciate that very much. The slides will be available for download, and then you can do anything you want with the slides, at least from my end of things. Sorry. How long would you recommend to decommission the old SharePoint site after migrating to a new one? That is a very good question. How long do I keep my old SharePoint up after I have done my migration? I'll be very honest with you. I try to get rid of that as soon as I can because it costs money to maintain two, and it costs a communication effort. It costs support tickets because people are confused despite any types of communication that I put. There's always people confused with the migration. So I put the old SharePoint environment, site collection, in read-only, and even if I'm not done the migration of my entire environment, if I finish the site collection, I instantly put that old site collection in read-only, and I typically leave it only for a month to 3 months. Now, of course, I keep backups so that if ever we forgot something somehow with the migration, they can still go and access the old site collection. But typically, 1 month is what I give them because they go to the old site collection, they realize it's read-only, and then they save into the new location. What's good about the new version of Office, if you folks have seen the new Office that comes with Office 365, but also the updates that are come for Pro Plus and the regular Office version, is that they're really well integrating into the SharePoint environment or Office 365 in that case. So it makes it a lot easier for people to open and then save as into their destination. Is there a matrix somewhere that compares what features are available on-prem only, hybrid, and Office 365? Yes, Microsoft has something. I don't have the link by heart. Whoops, I just closed the question box. They do have, whoops, they have something, I think it's called service description. I'm going to try and find the link. Look for Office 365 or SharePoint Online service description, I believe. And there is a link. I think I found it. That was quick. Let me see. That's actually not it. I'll try and link the different plans available. But basically, if you look for SharePoint Online differences or plan comparison, even though it says Office Online, it also includes SharePoint on premises, which is what people most of the time don't look at that article because it also includes SharePoint on premises, even though it says SharePoint Online. I think I actually just found it. Let me make sure. There we go. That's SharePoint Office 365 plans, and at the very bottom, SharePoint Online. I'm trying to see if they have on premises. There you go. I've got the link. I'm going to put it in the chat box right now. So here we go. In the chat box, I just added the link with the different comparison of on-premises and online. If you scroll all the way down, you will find that there is SharePoint on-premises, and you have the comparison there. Let me open up the question box again. The matrix, so we answered that question. You said something about problems with folders that have more than 5,000 items. Does that go for lists and libraries as well? Yes. It's not so much as a problem. It's as part of your assessment, you should identify any container, folder, list, or library that has over 5,000 items because there's a view threshold that exists where Microsoft stops showing anything if you go over that limit. There are ways to working around that limit. So if you identify them before, you can bypass that issue for your end users. So definitely just kind of Google 5,000 view threshold for SharePoint. You'll see ways of working around that problem. And in your inventory, in your assessment, if you identify them before, you can remedy them very early before. Build site content in cloud is good idea. I'm not sure I understand the question. Apologize for that, but yeah, it's always a good idea to create content in the cloud. What happens when you migrate to a new tenant with another language? Um, I mean, depends what you mean by that question. Obviously, everything is going to be changed. There's the interface of SharePoint that is already multilingual, so there's no impact whatsoever there. The impact is in the metadata values that you have stored. If you use a tool to migrate, the value is going to be the same as it was before, unless you manipulate it to change the language of it. But in terms of the interface, by default, SharePoint is already multilingual. So the fact that you go to another tenant that's another language doesn't really have any impact other than your term store for your terms. And yeah, that's pretty much it. Otherwise, it's pretty manageable. We are moving from SharePoint 2010 to 2016. If I were to do a restore, would I have to build a new environment, app, WebDB for 2020 and 13? Yes and no. technically, you're supposed to first install and manage 2013, upgrade to 2013, and then take the database, go to 2016. There is a kind of a hack. If you kind of Google, you will find a way because 2013 and 2016 kind of really have the same infrastructure for the most part. It has the same plumbing, so you can kind of go 2010 to 2016 using database attach. But yes, you will have to set up a new app web DB, but for 2016. Then you can take your content DB and kind of plug it there. However, there's going to be a database for your term store. There's going to be a database for your search. You're going to have to take that into consideration. The search, I would recommend just rebuilding the index from scratch, just because it's just cleaner that way. It will take a lot more time, but it'll be cleaner for that. The term store has not changed since 2010, so you should be fine upgrading that database. Microsoft wants you to go to 2013 first and then go to 2016, but you can just don't quote me on this publicly. You can kind of bypass all of that. Um, I've seen the O365 matrix, but not all three scenarios. So in the O365 matrix, you have the SharePoint comparison matrix, and all the way at the bottom of that page, you have on-premises matrix as well. It doesn't include, indeed, the hybrid comparison. But there's no hybrid, to be very honest with you, as I mentioned in the talk. The only hybrid that exists is for the search engine and anything that comes from the search engine. So Delve, the Search Center, content search web part, any web part that is driven from search, basically. A catalog feature, anything that comes from search is hybrid. Otherwise, there's no other hybrid feature that exists. Oh, sorry, I do apologize. There is a hybrid term store now. So you can have one term store that exists in Office 365 and can be used with your on-prem environment as well. So there is an on-prem, there is a hybrid term store and a hybrid search. Apologies. Do calculated fields still work? Absolutely. I'm not that familiar with the calculated field. I don't use it as much. So the comma versus semicolon, I'm not 100% sure. I don't want to lie to you. Um, Awesome. So I hope that answers most of the questions that we saw. If you have any other questions, just make sure you submit them. Find us on Twitter, find us on LinkedIn. We'll try to help as best we can. I hope everybody had a good time, learned something, provided guidance. Make sure you download the checklist. I think will be valuable for you as well. The presentation will be available along with the recording, but only via Visual SP webinars and subscriptions, of course.